Victor Curran, and I want to welcome you all on behalf of the Transcendentalism Council of First Parish in Concord. We have been around for about 12 years now, and what we do is to educate and celebrate the men and women who made Concord the home of American independence and imagination. And we are delighted to welcome this evening Professor Laura Dassow Walls, um, who is the William P. and Hazel B. White Professor Emerita of English, Notre Dame University. Um, Her scholarship focuses on literature and science, with a special concentration on Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and American Transcendentalism. As I believe many of our attendees tonight are members of the Thoreau Society, and we all recognize Laura as a longtime member of the Thoreau Society, who has served as a board member and as editor of the Thoreau Society Journal, the Concord Saunterer. Uh, uh, Her books include Henry David Thoreau, A Life, published in 2017, and that is the first full-length comprehensive biography of Thoreau in a generation. She's also the author of The Passage to Cosmos, Alexander von Humboldt and the Shaping of America, published in 2009. Both of those books were published by the University of Chicago Press. Uh, Her work has been supported by the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for Humanities, among others, and she continues to explore American transcendentalism more broadly as an intellectual, social, and environmental reform movement. And she is here tonight to tell us about her current research into the life and work of Barry Lopez, who brings Thoreau's vision into our own time. So welcome, Laura, and thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Victor, and thank you so much for all of you who've joined in. I see a number of old friends from the Thoreau Society. Welcome all, and hello from the Salish Sea out north of Seattle. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Give us the, I hope, PowerPoint. Okay. Now I need, now I need to get the button on the slideshow, which of course is hidden by the other button. All right, all right, you should now see, whoops, got a little previous, the title slide. Okay, and I'm going to minimize us. All right, good. So thank you again. Just to say, my original title for this talk was actually something different, The New Horizons of Barry Lopez. But then Victor suggested I compare Barry Lopez to Thoreau, which initially intimidated me, but then the more I thought about it, the more intrigued I got. So I thought, good, let's try it. I should say that I met Barry Lopez when I invited him to Notre Dame to give a talk in March of 2017. Notre Dame was Barry's alma mater, and he had, even though he wasn't traveling much at that point because of his ill health, he very much wanted to return. And I was very glad because it gave me a chance to spend several days with him, talking, getting to know him, watching him interact with my students and with the community. And since I had finished the writing of the Thoreau book, which was in production, I had been, of course, thinking about, well, what's going to be next? And I had been thinking I would really want to do somebody whose lifespan included the things that I remember from my own lifetime, a contemporary writer, and of course, somebody who deals in the same things that have fascinated me all my life. And in talking to Barry, I remember our first night together, I instantly thought, this is the one. I need to write about him. And it took a while because I thought somebody else was doing the biography, but things came together. And now I'm well along in the project. So you're some of the first people to hear a bit from this new work. So with that, I'll continue. In a way, calling Barry Lopez a modern Thoreau is a bit unfair. Thoreau was sui generis, and Lopez himself was fiercely independent, inimitable in his own way. Yet, as Larry Buell established in The Environmental Imagination, Thoreau does stand at the head of an important tradition of American environmental literature, and Barry Lopez is one of that tradition's most important voices. And rather more. Buell states that Lopez's book Arctic Dreams, quote, fully equals the classics of American autobiography and narrative fiction. This places Barry right up there with Thoreau as an American writer for the ages, and I agree. When you're in a forest surrounded by tree trunks, it's hard to identify the tallest trees or those with the deepest roots, the ones that might still be standing a century from now. I'm certain that Barry Lopez is one of those tall trees, but if studying Thoreau's career has taught me one thing, it's that if critics who see this don't make a stir about it, even a great writer can disappear from our radar. We cannot let this happen to Barry Lopez. In this respect, I'm heartened by Buell's remark that if Lopez's stature, quote, is not recognized for a while, and it probably won't be, that is because we have not learned how to read him. So today, if reading Lopez alongside Thoreau helps us to learn how to read him, then it's well worth the effort. In 1995, when Buell's landmark book was published, Lopez was widely recognized as one of an elite community of nature writers. We have Annie Dillard, Ed Abbey, Wendell Berry, and Peter Matheson. This ranking was based on Lopez's impressive body of work that now, 30 years later, looks like his early work. His first book, Desert Notes, remains a classic, a cult classic of American mysticism. They called it at the time Carlos Castaneda without the drugs. Remember, this was the 70s. His first major book, Of Wolves and Men, in 1978, broke open a profoundly original way of thinking about human-animal relations, catalyzing what we can now see as the field of animality studies. And his best-known book, The Elegiac Arctic Dreams, 1986, won national awards and rode the bestseller lists for some weeks. It's now seen as an all-time classic in the genres of nature writing and travel and exploration. Thus, in 1995, the comparison of Lopez to Thoreau seemed inevitable, the lineage clear and uncomplicated. But in the last 30 years, the world and Lopez have ventured into somewhat stranger seas, including the recognition of climate change and our entry into a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. Lopez responded in a raft of works, including in the non-Thoreauvian genres of journalism, short fiction, and personal memoir. The best known of these works would be About This Life, Journeys on the Threshold of Memory, autobiographical memoir, Light Action in the Caribbean, and Resistance, both of them collections of short stories. Resistance is especially interesting. It's his most politically charged work, written in the wake of the wars of 9/11, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those of us who were alive then remember what those days were like. The most daring was Sliver of Sky, Confronting the Trauma of Sexual Abuse, which was published in Harper's in 2013, in which Lopez revealed to the world that from the ages of 7 to 11, during his childhood in California, he had been repeatedly raped by a family friend who was also a sexual predator. In the aftermath of this essay, his name did acquire a certain unease, a loss of innocence perhaps, that did complicate, I believe, his earlier reputation in interesting ways. Near the end of his life, he completed Horizon, the culmination of 30 years of work and travel, a huge, dark, brooding volume that asks relentlessly who we are as human beings and where it is that we are going. What this trajectory allows us to see is this. How would a Thoreauvian sensibility react to the atomization of democracy, the militarization of American life, the acceleration of electronic media, the declarations of Me Too and Black Lives Matter, the callous repetition of mass shootings, the onset of climate change, in short, to the end of the world as once we knew it? Thoreau cannot really answer this question because we are well out beyond his world, living, as we keep hearing, in uncharted waters, in unprecedented times. But Barry rode into these waters right along with us. I think he can, and he does. For starters, let's go back to the picture as it appeared circa 1995, when Lopez was fully ensconced in the Thoreauvian tradition. This steers us toward a striking set of convergences, starting with their formative years. First, both Lopez and Thoreau were given remarkable educations for their day. After attending intensive and competitive college prep schools, they both enrolled at elite, private, all-male institutions. Each one was a flagship of their respective religions. Harvard, for Thoreau's New England Unitarianism, and the University of Notre Dame for Barry Lopez's American Catholicism. There, both were immersed for 4 solid years in literature, philosophy, and Christian theology, the classic Western liberal arts curriculum. Second, they both complemented their humanistic education with a fascination for the biological sciences, and a fondness for map making, and an aptitude for working with machinery. Third, they were both raised in powerful and highly orthodox faith traditions, which stayed with them right through college. Afterwards, though, they both drifted away from their respective churches to explore non-Western and so-called pantheistic dimensions, looking, as Lopez says, quote, for anyone who could speak the language of the God of no particular religion. Fourth, they both began their professional careers as teachers, using progressive, participatory, and non-hierarchical methods of teaching, and both imagined their classrooms could be nothing less than a demonstration project toward the reform of American education. And finally, both were subject early on to life-altering traumas. For Henry, the horrific death of his brother John; for Barry, the serial sexual abuse during his childhood, that sent them, in their lifelong quest for recovery, to seek safety, redemption, and solace in the natural world. Which leads into the years of their maturing careers. After the closure of their respective schools, both of them turned to writing as a serious career, turning their inward acts of healing outward toward the wider world. Both of them were mentored by powerful senior figures, Emerson for Thoreau, and for Lopez, the famous folklore professor Barry Tolkien, who encouraged him to drop out of his MFA program at the University of Oregon and write full-time. As young writers, both of them sought success on the commercial market, and it wasn't easy for either of them. And both of them completed ambitious major works that would, in retrospect, be regarded as groundbreaking, field-changing classics: Walden for Thoreau, Arctic Dreams for Lopez. Both would continue lifelong as writers, although Thoreau, unlike Lopez, had to supplement his income with a second job, surveying. And finally, both wrote absolutely massive journals. Thoreau's lifelong journal of 2 million words has been published almost in its entirety and is now regarded as a great work in its own right, arguably even greater than Walden. By contrast, Barry Lopez's 82-volume journal, and I found this listing of all 82 volumes on his desk in his study last time I was there. Someone had placed it there for me to look at. This 82-volume journal, his hidden masterpiece that was to have been revealed after his death, was consumed in September 2020 by the forest fire that destroyed the building that housed his archives. And what you see now on the screen is a photograph taken when the smoke was still rising of what was left of his archives, including the ashes of all 82 volumes of that journal. The flames incinerated the entirety of his 40-acre woods, along with 27 square miles of the Mackenzie River forest lands, hundreds of houses, and 2 entire towns. I've gotten so used to seeing it in its current state. I took the photograph, the larger one on your screen. That's just above Barry's property. Some of the trees on the right are just on the edge of his property line. I inserted the file photo above just to remind us that this is a northwest forest, not desert forest. This should be a temperate rainforest. It should be completely solid green year-round. Today, all that remains of Barry's journal are 2 fragments I discovered buried deep in the archives. One is a very interesting piece of juvenilia, but the other reveals a mature voice with a novelist's mastery of narrative, as broad and exacting in its shrewd analysis of human courage and frailty as Tolstoy. Imagine Thoreau's reputation today had his journal met a similar fate. Would we be having this conversation? As for the nature of their writing, both Thoreau and Lopez combined a passion for travel with love and loyalty for a single place. Concord for Thoreau, Oregon's Mackenzie River Valley for Lopez, where he lived in the same house for 52 years. Yet they both regularly left home behind. Thoreau, as we all know, traveled widely in Concord, but he also embarked on excursions to the Maine woods, Cape Cod, Canada, Minnesota. Had Thoreau lived as long as Lopez, and with similar resources, he most certainly would have extended his travels much farther. Lopez traveled constantly, making it the core of his career as a writer. He visited nearly 80 countries, seeking out places of great difficulty: the high Arctic, the ice shelves of Antarctica, the Kenyan bush and Australian outback, China, Lebanon, Auschwitz, South Africa. He made a point of traveling with scientific teams on field expeditions, and like Thoreau, he prepared with extreme seriousness, reading extensively, packing and repacking fastidiously, interviewing people wherever he went, taking massive notes. Both men, that is, traveled as professional writers. Their intent was never to relax, but to work, and their ultimate work was to bring back what they observed, experienced, and thought into major works of literature that probed deeply into the human condition, as well as what it meant to be immersed in unfamiliar and, for Lopez, often dangerous cultures and landscapes. And they brought home what they gathered into one anchored place, a domestic zone of consummate safety, where in their attic studios they wrote. Thoreau with a quill pen at his famous green school desk, Lopez with an IBM Selectric typewriter at a table facing the river here in his studio as it looks today. I should say, obviously, firefighters were able, and they worked very hard to save his house and the nearby cottage, guest cottage, but everything else was lost. We thank the firefighters, by the way, for the work it took, which was considerable and heroic. And not everybody in the valley was nearly as lucky. For them both, their home place was the central and stabilizing element in their work, becoming not merely a passive setting, but an active living character. Time and time again, one hears echoes of Thoreau when Lopez walks yet again to the river as to a friend, and marvels at its emotions and moods. One can almost hear him ask, in hushed awe, "Mackenzie, is it you?" In each, the woods and fields, the hillsides and creeks, the seasonal rhythms, the ever-shifting light, the ever-changing plants, and the wildlife coming and going are observed closely with scientific precision, yet also sensually, immersively. The natural world becomes the ground of being, the ground tone that vibrates through all their pages, anchoring and stabilizing a turbulent human world. So what does this impressive list of parallels reveal? First, cosmopolitanism. It's notable that while both writers are deeply centered in a single local place, they see that place through an unusually cosmopolitan, even planetary lens. One cannot peg either one as a regionalist. Thoreau famously elaborated Walden Pond into a microcosm of all creation. Lopez, by contrast, elaborates his Mackenzie River or his high Arctic, or indeed all his places, in highly specific and personal ways. Take for a sample this passage. Home from some trip, and here on the banks of the Mackenzie, I always feel that I've come together again as a person. I've lived here long enough now, intimate with the Mackenzie's low and high water stages, its winter colors, its harlequin ducks, its log jams and aerial plankton, tens and thousands of spiders balloon drifting in summer on breezes above the river, to know that without this river, I'm less. Listening to osprey strike the river, watching common mergansers shooting past me at 60 miles an hour a foot off the water, hearing the surging wind roiling the leaves of black cottonwoods around me, I become whole again. Throughout his writings, every place is described with his trademark lyrical precision, one uniquely luminous note sewn into the vast tapestry of the planet. The precision of both Thoreau and Lopez is made possible by their intimate familiarity, not only with local natural history, but also the depth and breadth of the Western canon. Both are deeply learned, but neither belabors their erudition. Instead, they draw on it for the cosmopolitan comparative perspective that I have elsewhere called Humboldtian, from Alexander von Humboldt's method. Places are seen both for themselves and in relation to elsewhere on the planet. One of Lopez's signature passages occurs in the opening of Arctic Dreams, when, to grasp the planetary strangeness of the Arctic, he walks us down the 100th meridian, from the North Pole to Mexico City, pointing out how the sun first moves around the sky in a circle and then only gradually is seen to rise and set. Up here in the Arctic, that is, there is literally no day to dawn. Walden's structuring concept evaporates along with all our temperate zone assumptions about the 4 seasons. Lopez's last great work, Horizon, is structured around this comparative method as he loops from a clear cut on the Oregon coast to archaeological digs in the remote Canadian Arctic, to the Galapagos Islands, where he meditates on modern ecotourism, to a field station in the Kenyan bush, where he seeks hominid fossils, then to the Australian outback to walk with indigenous guides, and finally to Antarctica on a series of polar research expeditions, all seen in relation to each other and to further travels elsewhere, through layers of both personal memory and colonial history. Second, curiosity. I'm curious about my immediate surroundings, Barry told an interviewer. When I travel, I'm curious about everything. I have no sense of reserve when it comes to wanting to know something. And part of that bottomless curiosity is his respectful fascination with non-Western cultures and religions. Unlike Thoreau, Barry Lopez never resonated with the Buddhism that so moved his friends Peter Matheson and Gary Snyder. But he did, like Thoreau, respond deeply to Native American philosophy, in which Lopez found an articulation of beliefs he grew up with, but had not known how to voice or credit until he read their words. Several times he apprenticed himself to indigenous hunters to break through his own Western training, and he wrote often in support of Native American rights and sovereignty. In 2007, he organized a formal reconciliation ceremony between Texas Tech University and the Comanche peoples to acknowledge and honor the lives they lost in attacks by the American Army. That is, both Thoreau and Lopez inherited a position of privilege within white settler colonialism, and both used that privilege to abet interest in and respect for Native peoples, and to question the assumptions that made colonialism possible, out of a vast sense of unease about their Western inheritance and fear for all it had destroyed and was destroying. As this suggests, finally, they both share a high seriousness, a moral gravity, a profoundly ethical orientation. Both men sought to live their philosophy as deliberately and faithfully as humanly possible, and they sought in their writings to disseminate to all who would listen what they knew to be a working ethics that responds to personal and individual alienation, as well as to the great political and social evils of our era. This was from their shared scriptural foundation, enhanced by a conviction that as writers they had stepped up to a public pulpit, and from that height they must cherish the word as sacred. Both writers became, in this sense, secular preachers. Their friends often compared them both to monks. Indeed, not only did Lopez often seem like a monk, he deliberately strove to live like one, a sacred life devoted to the highest calling. As he told me more than once, your work is your prayer. Twice in his life he entered a monastery thinking that he might join it. The second time was at Gethsemane, the Trappist monastery in Kentucky, where his hero Thomas Merton then lived. Barry loved it. Life in the community, devoted to contemplation, lived close to the land. He loved it so much that he knew it was not the right path for him. He left, choosing instead marriage and life in the world as a teacher, mentor, and writer. What motivated them both was their conviction that traditional scripture and traditional churches no longer fit the needs of the modern or postmodern world. Hence, religion, the deepest driving force in both their lives, needed to be renewed and rewritten into contemporary idioms. Walden, as we're being reminded most lately by Alda Balthrop Lewis, among others, is a modern scripture. And during the 1960s, Thoreau's Protestant polemic, Civil Disobedience, circulated as a kind of sacred text among the youth movement, which included Barry Lopez. Among his student papers is an admiring essay on civil disobedience. But his mature religion pointed not to any written text, but to the land itself. Lopez held that in the unharrowed land, one could still see a sacred order, and he believed his task as a writer to be to make that order visible and knowable to his readers, so that we might align our minds and beings accordingly. As he said in an early interview, quote, "If you can strip yourself of the desire to order and to name, and see the land entirely for itself, you see in the relationship of all its elements the face of God." In that sense, Lopez held that the land and its beings will always exceed us. No matter how much we know, there will always be an unknowable remainder, an ultimate mystery. As he wrote, I guess I do want to go ahead. As he wrote in Arctic Dreams, the physical landscape is baffling in its ability to transcend whatever we would make of it. It is as subtle in its expression as turns of the mind and larger than our grasp, and yet it is still knowable. The mind, full of curiosity and analysis, disassembles a landscape and then reassembles the pieces, the nod of a flower, the color of the night sky, the murmur of an animal, trying to fathom its geography. At the same time, the mind is trying to find its place within the land, to discover a way to dispel its own sense of estrangement. We moderns, in other words, have in effect expelled ourselves from Eden, which is neither mythical nor in the past, but here, immanent, present at all times. One of Lopez's great questions is whether that expulsion is part of the human condition or the heritage of Western modernity, and if the latter, whether there is a horizon of possibility beyond our estrangement from the land, which is also an estrangement from each other, a horizon from which might come a future beyond the darkness that we see coming toward us now. This edges us toward the ways in which Lopez is a rather different writer than Thoreau. Partly this is simply because Thoreau grew up in a post-World War II, Cold War world shadowed by the omnipresent specter of nuclear apocalypse, and when he was old enough to be drafted, the insanity of the Vietnam War. He managed never to get drafted. His response strikes us as Thoreauvian because Thoreau opened his path. As I mentioned a moment ago, Lopez first encountered Thoreau in the 60s as the dissident writer of civil disobedience who told young people like Barry how to stop the machine. In the 70s, Lopez embarked for himself on the Thoreauvian project of living simply out in the woods of Western Oregon with a typewriter and a copy of E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful by his side. But this was part of the zeitgeist. Lots of people did the same thing, at least for a while. But here is where darker and more personal elements come into play. As Lopez wrote in his 2013 essay, Sliver of Sky, his memoir detailing the profound effect on his life of traumatic sexual abuse, his emotional attachment to his Oregon home became essential to any ongoing sense of well-being that he had, any sense of security. He attributed this ongoing need to his childhood trauma when, quote, "The deepest and sometimes only relief I had was when I was confronted with the local elementary forces of nature." He writes about the Santa Ana winds, the Pacific storm crashing into the local beaches, the winter floods inundating their neighborhood, all of them giving him a sense of what it was to become, he writes, fully alive. As he listened as, quote, "big winds swirled the dry leaves of eucalyptus trees," or sat alone somewhere in a rarely traversed part of the Santa Monica Mountains, awaiting a glimpse of a coyote or a brush rabbit, I would feel exhilaration, encouragement. But as the adult Lopez goes on, deep inside I knew things remained awry. It would not be until the 1990s that as his marriage of over 25 years collapsed and he spun into yet another period of deep depression, that he would face the fact of his abuse and seek help. The ensuing journey took many years, but looking back at it from the vantage point of 2013, when Sliver of Sky had finally seen print, Lopez could say that as a result he had discovered, quote, "a greater capacity within myself to empathize with another person's nightmare." As he continued, quote, "most of the unresolved fear and anger I once held on to has now metamorphosed into compassion and into understanding of the predicaments nearly everyone encounters at some level, at some time in their lives." Through all the years of facing this trauma and rethinking his life in its dark light, the last 30 years of his life, Lopez was working on his masterpiece, Horizon. Its intertwined themes of social and environmental justice had always been present in his work. Indeed, he abhorred the phrase nature writing because it marginalizes the only American genre that asks, as he said, what is the relationship of the individual to the state? What is the relationship of the individual to society? What is the relationship of human culture to place? In Horizon, the inner compassion of his earlier work for those who suffer violence, both slow violence, in Rob Nixon's phrase, and fast, turns outward into a sustained and direct inquiry into the roots of that violence and a plea to remember the victims, all the victims, of colonial violence across the globe. Lopez's burning question, what will become of us, is asked in the face of the calamities, both past and impending, wrought by war and colonial conquest and commercial capitalism, including, now, climate change. That is, Lopez began it in Thoreau's epoch, the Holocene, when nature was solid underfoot and eternal above, the ultimate guarantee of a secure world. But he ended his life in the Anthropocene, when nature, once his solace and his security, had been declared dead. What happens to our premier contemporary nature writer when nature ceases to exist? when, as Lopez says in Horizon, quote, "We no longer seem to be sailing in a time of fixed stars, of accurate chronometers, and of reliable routes." The nature that ended in Lopez's lifetime is Thoreau's nature, imagined as a transcendence of the human, an infinite, eternal, untouchable, sacred order, which in modernity releases the material world to our hands to exploit however we wish for our own profane ends. Thoreau, of course, resists this, not by regressing to some more primitive view, as is often charged, but by advancing to what scientists would later call an ecological view, in which harm to one affects harm to all. But Thoreau also retains the pre-modern Christian faith in nature as infinitely beyond the human and therefore safe, in some ultimate and immensely comforting way, from all harm. Thus he could write that even though Walden Pond is deforested, Walden will, in a deeper way, live forever and eternally. And so with its creatures. One of Walden's most moving passages for me has always been the vision that Thoreau sees in the eyes of a partridge. He writes, "The remarkably adult yet innocent expression of their open yet serene eyes is very memorable. All intelligence seems reflected in them. Such an eye was not born when the bird was, but is coeval with the sky it reflects." By contrast, Lopez's Arctic Dreams delineates the divinity of nature through a powerful sense of its absolute otherness, both beautiful and terrifying, inspiring both reverence and fear. In one of the book's more famous passages, Lopez literalizes this reverence through a gesture. One evening he goes for a walk on the tundra among nesting birds, who must build their nests on the ground, so their vulnerability is extreme. He writes, "I gazed down at a single-horned lark no bigger than my fist. She stared back, resolute as iron." Lopez offers her his respect by bowing to the nesting bird, to the birds, to all the birds, to their wild, dedicated lives. In his gesture of respect, he does not handle the lark as Thoreau handled the partridge, nor does he see in its eyes an intelligence coeval with the sky. Instead, he sees the fierce resolution of another being, another self, both familiar and alien, like the more formidable snowy owls nesting nearby. As Lopez stands motionless before them, the wild glare in their eyes recedes. One settles back on the nest, quote, "with an attitude of primitive alertness," while the other watches him and, quote, "immediately sought a bond with my eyes if I started to move." This is détente, neither less nor more. At the end of Arctic Dreams, Lopez returns to the scene as a farewell statement, which he broadens to a more abstract idea about who we are in relation to nature. Quote, I bowed to what knows no deliberating legislature or parliament, no religion, no competing theories of economics, an expression of allegiance with the mystery of life. I held the bow until my back ached and my mind was emptied of its categories and designs, its plans and speculations. I bowed before the simple evidence of the moment in my life in a tangible place on the earth that was beautiful. As he stands, he glimpses his own desire, his own Arctic dream. Quote, what I had dreamed was only a pattern, some beautiful pattern of light, a state that, like the light, is unbounded, nurturing, suffused with wisdom and creation, a state in which one has absorbed that very darkness which before was the perpetual sign of defeat. Arctic Dreams is a book of light that faces the darkness, both the long darkness of Arctic winters and the brutal changes brought to the land and its inhabitants by industrial development. Many years later, when Lopez confronts that very darkness of his childhood, he will tell us that embracing darkness, even the darkness within ourselves, is the gateway to compassion. This capacity This movement towards solidarity with all beings, given that we are all alike, fragile, precarious, living like the lark on the edge of extinction, culminates in Horizon, a book that takes us into scene after scene of an achingly beautiful and deeply troubled planet to make us feel deeply that the destruction of another's world will be known as our loss too. In this book's opening chapter, set on a clear-cut high above the Pacific Ocean, just about 5 miles north of where I took this photograph on your screen, Barry Lopez sees in the inflammation of a spectacular sunset, quote, a conflagration, and he wonders whether, quote, it's only a delusion to wish for the continuation of promising human life on a planet that we are remaking with a sixth extinction. What would happen to our plans for survival if we were no longer stymied by a belief in the value of permanence, or no longer distracted by the hope of returning to a world that has already come and gone? At the time of publication in 2019, this was pure speculation. Then, in September 2020, flames driven by a hot eastern windstorm funneled over a mountain pass into forests desiccated by drought and exploded down the Mackenzie River Valley, mile over mile. The terrible conflagration consumed Barry's home and sanctuary and much of his life's work. The global destruction wrought by climate change had literally come home to destroy everything he most loved. Overnight, his world, nearly everything, overnight, his world, the green home he loved so much and relied on so deeply and intimately, had truly come and gone. How is it possible to walk into this darkness and come out the other side with compassion? One answer is that Barry Lopez did not come out the other side. The fire that consumed his home also consumed his life, which ended shortly afterward on Christmas Day, 2020. But the other answer is that Barry the writer did live long enough to speak to us from that other side, starting in the title of the book that he began to assemble, his most recent book, published just this year, with his wife Deborah Gwartney in their last days together. Embrace fearlessly the burning world. How is it possible to embrace both the living green sanctuary of river and forest and the terrible wildfire that burned it to char and ashes? Here's a photograph that goes right through my heart of Barry standing after they first let people back in on the ashes of his archives, still smoking. You can read in his face the unreadable expression, whatever it is that you can imagine him thinking. And here is their answer, what his wife Deborah Gwartney posted on one of the charred trees by their home. The paper burns, but the words fly free. Words taken from, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, Akiba ben Joseph, a Jewish sage from 80 before Christian era. This is his house and the cottage as they appear today from the road. As you see this, you must know that before the fire, this was a wall of green, and the cottage and the house were completely hidden, could not be seen from the road, nor could they see the road or the river beyond it. What the fire lays bare is the sheer contingency of our world today, the Anthropocene world, where the humanity that Thoreau so exalted is humiliated by the discovery that there are no guarantees, not even of virtue, not even for us. We too, just like the natural world, are fragile and contingent, the product of a series of contingencies. That spark that those winds carried over that pass to burn out that valley and no other, that year, 2020, and no other. The world outside of us will not take care of us as we pursue our dreams or fight our wars. We must redream our world, must realize that that which shelters us must itself be sheltered by us, that this is the precarity of living in the Anthropocene. These are words by Sean McGrath, whose work has helped me to think through this problem. The fire teaches us that transcendence has not at all disappeared, but entered our daily lives in the most intimate and terrifying of ways. It teaches us that nature is not a guarantee, but a gift. And as a gift, it comes with a fearsome contingency. As McGrath writes on, quote, "No gift need be given. The gift that must be given is not a gift. To be gifted is to be the contingent recipient of a contingency, or in the theological word, to be graced." Early in Horizon, Lopez records a moment of grace. When camped on the clear-cut, he awakes to soft sounds and senses 5 Roosevelt elk grazing outside his tent. He rises and feels his way toward them in the dark, following them until just as they had appeared, they suddenly disappeared, in the way of animals that are not only wild, but free to browse the mountainsides, to make do with clear-cuts and roads, to do whatever they wanted, whenever they wished. To recognize their freedom to come and go is to acknowledge this moment of grace freely given, and it is to acknowledge transcendence, to feel it as sacred. For the freedom out of which the gift was given, including this gift of 5 mute elk in the night, quote, transcends the order of necessity that otherwise governs human relations. This is Sean McGrath reminding us how we might take on this gift. As he continues, the gift is horizoned by the unfathomable freedom of the other. The gift of elk in the night, the gift of the Mackenzie River with its salmon and mergansers, and the sense of fellowship it brings with good friends who visit and share reverence for the land, if these are gifts to embrace, then so too must be the ravaging fire. There is no other way. Embrace fearlessly the burning world, Lopez wrote. Even of his childhood darkness, he could say to himself, wake up, it's a gift. Use it instead of denying it. After 30 years of witnessing a burning and mutilated world, he offers Horizon to us as a hymn to embrace it all as he has learned he must do. Near the book's end, Lopez sits at a cafe in a town in the Tierra del Fuego, and he considers staying there, an indefinite stay, learning to sail perhaps, and ignoring all the trouble to the north, which is, of course, in this most southerly outpost of them all the trouble of the earth everywhere. But in the end, he cannot resist the pull of the mutilated world. I am still alive, he writes, quote, sitting here in the restaurant and want to be an emissary for all of its life, even if that idea has become obsolete, close quote. So Barry returns, and he sits down again at his typewriter, and he takes up once again the emissary's task, trying to awaken us to hear the voices from beyond the horizon, where what we know meets the unfathomable freedom of the other whose light can embrace the darkness. And I'll end with a photo I took last month of Barry's gravesite just above his house. The rock on which, under which he is buried, you can see that it is split. The fire split it. Of course, it was once covered with moss, and he's buried in the crack between the two splits, between the two pieces. His wife, Deborah, has installed a bench where we can sit and meditate. They have replanted it with ferns. The property is now owned and is part of the Mackenzie River Trust, which is working to rehabilitate not just this land, but the land of the Mackenzie River Valley. So this is a site to consider both what has gone and what is coming and what we may do with the reality that this gives us. And on the gravestone, the legend reads, Barry Lopez, his life helped. That's it. Thank you very much.
I invite anyone who has a question for Professor Walls to put it in the Zoom chat.
And please feel free to ask whatever comes to mind. This is new work for me, and no one has heard this paper until you all have. So I'm sure there are questions, and I look forward to addressing them.
We have not a question, but a compliment. Very moving.
Thank you. I do find myself moved, and I think that's the emotional state that allows us to move forward.
Yeah. I
Oh,
have.
yeah.
There we go. Oh,
I see it popped up conveniently on my screen. How did he die? No, I actually didn't mention. Um, as I said, he was devoted to traveling, and he loved to travel. And even as he, in his last moments, he was imagining traveling, where he would go, what he would do. But in 2013, he received the news that he had prostate cancer, and it was aggressive, and it had already spread to multiple organs in his body. So for 7 years, he was in treatments for cancer, and he knew he couldn't travel the way he had been, so he concentrated on finishing Horizon. The treatments were doing good work for him, and up until even November, before his death in December, the doctors were saying a year, maybe two, you're looking great. And then very, very suddenly, it just, the way cancer does sometimes, it just took over. And very, very swiftly, he was gone. But he lived those last days in great serenity, surrounded by family.
Okay, there is, if you're looking at the questions, there's a question about the Alexander Humboldt book.
Yeah, the questions have taken to appearing and disappearing too quickly, so I'll
The
rely on
question,
you.
this is from Jane Gordon. How did your work on Humboldt inform this new project?
When I first, well, I should say, go back. When I first started reading Humboldt, or thinking hard about why I was so moved by Humboldt, I of course thought of Thoreau, and that opened that whole question and a lot of my earlier work. And then when I started reading Barry's more recent work, I thought, well, this is our Humboldt. I mean, he seemed so Humboldtian to me, in the way he traveled, in the spirit in which he traveled, and the kind of work that he did. And of course, there he is sitting in front of me. So I asked him, and of course, like most Americans, he'd heard of Humboldt. Was kind of like, Humboldt? Yeah, really? So he read my book and came back and told me, oh my God, I cannot believe that I never knew Humboldt's story, that I never knew it in time to do something with it. But it's too late for me to really take this all on board now. Please forgive me. And I said, Barry, that's okay. Don't worry about sort of, bringing this as an influence in your life. I just wanted you to realize that you're part of an immense tradition. Humboldt, Darwin. He does write a lot about Darwin. And that this tradition is still vibrant, and more vibrant now than ever in the world. So yeah, that's how those two connect.
Here's this one is a longer question. Maybe be easier if you read it yourself, about Orestes Bronson.
Oh, Bronson, my gosh. Let's see if I can find it.
I'll read it to you if you like.
Oh
Or
yeah, no, I've got it here. Thinking about Bronson who drifted. Oh yeah, so this is a
if
question.
you would,
Bronson drifted from transcendentalism, converted to Catholicism. Yeah, and I think, well, and I didn't mention Isaac Hecker, but Isaac Hecker actually tried to, well, quite directly tried to tell Thoreau that you are basically Catholic and you are basically a monk. Why don't you become a Catholic monk? Which is, I think, exactly what you are. And of course, Thoreau was aghast at the thought. Um, but anyway, uh, so Barry Lopez, who drifted from Catholicism and apparently aligned himself with what we would call perhaps the transcendentalist view of divinity. Yeah, I think I'm not Catholic myself, so I speak as an outsider to the tenets of the Catholic faith. But the Eucharistic sense that nature and the created world um, is not like God is not in it or of it or somehow, but this is in a fundamental way God. Infuses Barry's thinking and his thinking about when he can look at the land and speak of it as the face of God and its relationships as divine. Uh, is a material form. His thinking, his work, his approach is does not shy from the material world into a kind of pure realm of spirituality, but it's always embedded, always redemptive, always thinking of the immanence of the sacred. And that is a tone and a voice that I heard many, many times in the priests that I worked with at Notre Dame, and came to respect greatly. A deep, and it's also something that infuses probably the greatest work that has ever yet come out on climate change and on what we must do about it, which is Pope Francis's Laudato Si, and Laudato Si is something that, I mean, if you take Laudato Si and put it up against Barry Lopez's work, you realize that they are absolutely congruent with each other. So it's a very large question and one that I hope to think harder about as I write this book, and I hope that I will have more to say about that, informed by my Catholic friends in the future.
Speaking of your book, I'm jumping from the Q and from the chat to the Q&A because there are a couple of questions that have popped up over there. This is a very logistical question. When will you complete the book?
Oh my God. Well, I don't know. I will say that I'm once this particular now that I've sort of worked out this lecture and my thinking about this question, because obviously at first I was like, I just want to start the writing, and then I thought, no, doing this lecture is important because I need to connect. I need to clarify in my own mind the connection between the work I did on Humboldt and, of course, the others, Emerson and Humboldt, with this 21st century work and my own sense of something both deeply resonant but also complexly different. This lecture comes on the heels of a number of weeks in the archives, which are at Texas Tech. Long relationship there between Barry Lopez and a wonderful, marvelous, extremely important, and I think underused collection of, again, the phrase is inevitable, nature writers at Texas Tech. If whatever name springs to mind right now, is that person is probably in this collection, the Sowell collection at Texas Tech, largely because Barry and his friends agreed to put their papers there. Anyway, so I was immersed in all that. I've now read and collected thousands of pages of work. I have thousands more to go. But I am starting to, as soon as the dust clears from writing this lecture, I will be starting to draft the first half of the book, and hope to have the second half done next year, and then we'll see about publishing it. So don't hold your breath, but it's not a forever project. I'm motivated to finish it.
Thank you. Here's a more open-ended question. Who are the Thoreaus and Lopezes of today?
Oh, well, the people in the Sowell collection in Texas Tech. And I say that because, well, I mean, you saw the picture that I put up, Annie Dillard.
Mhm.
A long time, by the way, early member and steadfast long-term member of the Thoreau Society. So Annie Dillard, certainly, absolutely. And every one of them, Ed Abbey and Wendell Berry, Wendell Berry and Barry Lopez had a very long, lifelong kind of conversation going. Uh, Peter Matheson, less a conversation there than a bit of a rivalry, I think, but he would certainly be in there. Terry Tempest Williams, who was still in the 90s when that picture, if it had been in the 2000s, she would be central to that picture. Terry Tempest Williams, absolutely. Bill McKibben, um, very admired Bill, even as he said, "My God, I don't know how he does it." Uh, and I'm sure there are others, and you're probably thinking of others. I know I'm going to think of 10 names the instant I stop talking that I should, but you're probably thinking of some others. And I think the point is that there is a community of people. Rebecca Solnit, that's one that comes immediately to mind. Yeah, there is a community of people, and it's surprisingly large and rich, who are in this broader tradition. And I think I'd like to see them all shelved front and center in every bookstore in America, not somewhere back in the back corner, down on the lower shelf, the one that's always labeled nature, because they're writers that speak to the entirety of our world. Anyway, yeah.
I have a fairly practical question and then a broader question. The practical
Hmm.
question is, if someone wanted to visit his home site, Lopez's
Hmm.
home, would it be necessary to contact the trust that oversees the property?
Yeah, yeah, it would, and they would welcome such a visit because so this was a long held dream, and Deborah Gwartney has worked mightily since Barry's death. The foundations were laid. Barry had done much work with the Mackenzie River Trust, but deeding a house and 40 acres of land is a whole different deal. So that has been accomplished, and they are starting to. They're working on rehabilitating the land. The house and the cottage are ready. And starting this summer, they're doing a pilot program for visiting artists and writers. And so the arrangement is that as the months and years go by, it will be opened for public events and for writers and artists who want a week or 2 weeks to stay, to be there, to watch the reforestation and the greening of the land, to participate if they wish. So all of this is in the making, and the first people who will be piloting this program are scheduled for, I believe, September, this coming September. So yes, contact the Mackenzie River Trust, learn who they are, and um, talk to Joe Mole, the director, and see how you might be able to visit and offer your help.
Thank you, Laura. We have two last questions that um, are kind of in the same vein, which is not surprising because they're asked by people who live on the same street. Um, do you have a sense of how the trials of his last months affected his faith in life? And the second question is, thank you for this wonderful lecture. Could you share more memories from your personal conversations with Barry? What
Oh
was his
gosh, yeah.
personality like? What was he like with the students when you were at Notre Dame?
Sure. Well, I would say to the first question, this was obviously a severe challenge to I think in the sense, the last shred of the sense, and it's something I wrestle with, of, the eternal nature that uh, the kind of green world would take care of us, would embrace us the way he feels embraced by the land. And that, and this is a very physical and sensual sense. I mean, you can say in your mind, in your head, oh, I know that, the world comes, the world goes, change is eternal. But to actually stand on this land, and it still shakes me. I couldn't, after a few days there, I had to drive up north on the road to the place where the fire hadn't hit, and just spend the afternoon wandering around where it's still green, and just, I was desperate not to smell soot. The smell is just the feeling of sootiness got to me in a kind of visceral way. So the challenge was met, and I think that's what's striking, is that one could imagine this being a kind of terminal challenge, but it wasn't. I mean, his body did succumb to cancer, but to the very end, his sense of renewal and engagement and the intensity of his passion for going back to the land, for reforesting, and he had visions for it. And he was communicating to people and so now when you talk to the young people who are doing the work of replanting the land, they are so excited to be there, and they see this as perhaps the most important work they could be doing, working with the community to rebuild the land and help the land for the trying to help community members rebuilding houses, and also reforesting, or in the case of Barry's land, you'll notice a number of trees still standing, which gives the illusion that the forest could kind of be okay. The problem is that the trees are burned at the roots, and many, if not most of those trees will come down in the next 2 or 3 years. And the the state of Oregon, the Department of Natural Resources wants to come and take them all out for safety reasons. And they want to salvage log. And so what they're trying to do on Barry Lopez's land is leave the trees standing, let them fall on their own, and let the land recover on its own without removing the tree trunks. And they're adamant about that. So it will be a laboratory for the natural recovery of a temperate rainforest. And they don't know what kind of forest will come back in climate change. And they will try to help it along, but they're very carefully studying to see what this microcosm can tell us about the future. So the young people, this was Barry's vision. So yes, his faith, absolutely, faith in a seed, as Thoreau says, absolutely was tested, and absolutely came through more than intact. It came through renewed. Well, personal, more memories. COVID kept us apart. We were going to do a series well, we had lots of plans. I was going to live in the cottage, and he was going to bring me his journal to read, and the book that I was going to write was going to, the journal was going to be the spine. So with that gone, I feel this sense of a kind of hollow, this hollow earth, and I'm trying to figure out all the negative space around it so that I can understand that center point. But I'm all the more passionate about doing so because of something that Barry said to me in a phone conversation after the fire. He said that he told me about that scene taken where his archives are smoldering in ashes. He was telling me about that, and he said, Laura, first of all, he said, Laura, the land is flayed, like a corpse just flayed open. And then he said he stood on that spot with his archives, and he said, I feel erased. And it just, I mean, of course, you want to say, Barry, there's so much left, but that feeling of erasure, I try to understand what that meant. But as a biographer, what more inspiration could you have than have your subject tell you, in this situation, I feel erased, and of course one wants to ride to the rescue. And so that, and that's the other thing. He was interested in my work more generally, and his words, "Your work is your prayer," became kind of a motto. Um, it's hard work to do this, and a kind of motto. But more than that, I mean, it's just, it's the give and take of the conversations. His delight when Trump lost the election, for instance, his voice, coming over the telephone. This is what we need. Trump is becoming irrelevant. That that is the way that we have to fight. And so, don't fight against your enemy, make them irrelevant, and then you can take the field. And I don't know, I could go on and on. But just from the first moment together, as he spoke about a walk he imagined, a journey he imagined taking up the Rift Valley of Africa all the way up through the Middle East into Europe, just this grand vision. I looked there at this man who can barely walk, and I'm thinking, how could you possibly be telling me you were going to do this? It just was like a fantasy, and yet it felt real. And I realized it's that projection of reality, that sense of, well, perhaps if he doesn't do it, somebody will, and they'll write about it, and it'll be done. And it's that spirit burning through him that I felt. Yeah, I'll stop with that.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm grateful for your sharing this evening with us. I'm grateful to
Thank you all.
all of our registrants who